In the last part, we will now introduce one more layer of security by securing the API calls. And this we'll do entirely in demos. First, I will head back to Auth0 and register my API there. In the second part of the demo, we will now configure our API endpoints in the application, and then we'll make changes so that the API calls are also authenticated. At this point, the API isn't protected, and basically everyone can now access it. That won't be a good solution in a real-world situation. Let us finish this setup by looking at how we can indeed block unauthorized access to the API. In the end, hiding certain functionality from the Blazor app won't help since it's running client-side, and users can always bypass any security measures we put inside of the Blazor app. We'll first head back to the Auth0 interface, and here we will now select APIs. We'll click on Create API. In the dialog, we'll give the API a name again and an identifier, known as the audience. As it says here, it is recommended that this is a URL, but it won't be used. It doesn't need to be a real URL, indeed. Leave the signing algorithm at its default value and then click on Create. At this point, Auth0 is configured. Now we need to head back to Visual Studio. Now we need to make changes to the appsettings.json of the API project, so the one containing the controllers. In there, we'll now add configuration code for Auth0. The domain is the same as we already used, but now without HTTPS. Then, in the audience, place the identifier of the API. We also need to bring in a NuGet package that will help us with the authorization of the server APIs, and that is the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Bearer package. With that package added, now we need to make some changes in the program CS again. The code that I've added here now configured our API project to use authorization based on bearer tokens. In other words, a token will need to be sent along with the request, and that'll be validated. Only if the token is included and is valid will access be granted to the API. We also need to bring in middleware so that authentication and authorization is supported. We can now go back to our controllers and add the authorize attribute here too. I've done this now for the employee controller. If we now run our application again, we'll get an exception. Indeed, what is happening now? Well, we are still from our Blazor application trying to send a request without a token included, and that is now blocked by the API. So we'll need to make additional changes to the Blazor app so that a token is included. That token is the access token, and we can easily configure Blazor to include the token with any API call we make. To do this in the program, when I make my calls using HTTP client, I'm now going to say that I want to use the base address authorization message handler as the HTTP message handler. This will attach the token for us automatically to the request made to the application's base URI. So that's the one hosting the controller. While we are in the program, we also need to add this line here. I'm adding here the audience parameter. This will let Auth0 know that we're calling the API, which is identified by the audience setting value. We do still need to make another change, and that is adding the audience in the appsettings.json of the Blazor app. That is the identifier that we created for the API. If we now run the application again, our API is of course protected and our Blazor application runs fine again, now including the token with the HTTP request.